my name is Nezumi, and I'll be showing you how I made the Oathtaker or Golden Eagle bow from Shadow of the Tomb Raider. I made the pattern in Adobe Illustrator first, printed it, and cut it out. I cut a PVC pipe the length of my pattern, and I cut the pipe in half to make it easier for transportation later. Using a heat gun, I heat up the PVC pipe and shape it to the pattern. And then insert either a wooden dowel or smaller PVC pipe inside so that you can connect the two. My bow perfectly pressure fitted together, but you can also add magnets to help as well. And here you can see how my bow disconnects. Ignore the hole. I tried to add magnets originally, but for me it didn't work out. Off screen, I took the bow to the belt sander to help get that tapered edge. Next, cover the entire pole in masking tape and trace a line down the side so you can turn this into a pattern. Carefully cut down that line, and then you can put this pattern onto 2mm craft foam and cut that out. And don't forget to add registration marks so it'll make it easier when connecting the craft foam together later. And here you can see me tracing that onto craft foam. Make sure you add a little bit of extra space to account for the curvature of the pole. I didn't do that here, so I had to fill that in later. Using contact cement, apply it to the bow and the foam, and once dry you can stick them together. Using parchment paper or normal paper, you can use that to cover up the parts you don't want to be glued yet. And then I use foam clay to fill in any gaps, and using my finger and water to smooth it all out. After that dried, I took a soldering iron and burned in a wood texture. Next, I cut foam dowels and rubber insulation tubes in half for decoration. And I glued those on with contact cement. Some of the larger parts are just made out of 2mm craft foam. And I also took a soldering iron to add some detail onto some of these parts. Now to make the eagles. Using my pattern from before, I traced it onto 10mm craft foam. I cut out a few of these to fit the thickness of the bow and then glued it together with contact cement. And off screen I dremeled it down to curve out the edges. Next, I heated up 2 pieces of Worbla and sandwiched the foam in between. and I took a wooden sculpting tool to help push all the edges in, and then I glued that onto the bow. Using more Worbla, I started adding details. For larger parts, I just covered it in tape to get an exact pattern and then cut that out. For the feathers, I used 2 layers of Worbla by itself, stuck them together, cut out the shape, and then used a wooden sculpting tool to trace out the feather pattern. And since the eagle is covered in Worbla, I can just heat the feathers up and stick them directly onto it. And here's how the finished eagle looked. Next, these weird golden rectangles. I tried a few different methods and I finally landed on this one. Taking Worbla, I sandwiched a piece of 2mm craft foam in between, making sure that top layer is completely black Worbla. I used black Worbla because it's much more smooth, so I didn't have to sand or prime it afterwards. I didn't show it because it was way too dark and tiny, but I sculpted in with more Worbla all the little details. Then, taking scrap foam, I made a mold box with lots of hot glue to seal the edges. And then I sprayed it with a layer of silicone mold release. And I mixed up a 2-part silicone and slowly poured it in to avoid air bubbles. And after 24 hours, you can demold it. Next, I heated up thermo beads. Since thermo beads are clear when heated up, I mixed paint into it so I could see what I was doing. And applying a little bit at a time, make sure you really fill every single spot in the mold with it. Then I applied a piece of normal Worbla to the back of it. I found that this helped keep its shape. The thermo beads by themselves are just too malleable. So it took a few tries to get this right, but at a certain temperature it was cool enough to remove from the mold, but not too cool that I couldn't bend it anymore. And I carefully bent it over the bow to get the right shape, making sure not to ruin the texture. Since I was going to cover this all with paint later, I just had fun and used random colors. Here's why that Worbla on the back was really helpful. I was able to heat that up so it was hot enough to stick together without ruining the design. I found that if I only did this with the thermo beads, heating it up would instantly ruin the whole thing. They weren't perfect, so I filled in any gaps with hot glue to make sure it really stayed. This is a great technique if you don't have fancy tools, but if you do, I would highly recommend either 3D printing this or using a laser cutter on some craft foam. And using quick seal, I made sure to fill in all the gaps. And I did this to both the Worbla part and also the rest of the bow. You can smooth it out with just your finger and water, and for the Worbla parts I used a clay spatula to help get it extra flat. And taking 2-part epoxy, I used that to do smaller details on the eagle like the beak, and also using that to fill in any larger gaps that needed to be sanded down. Then I gave the entire bow a few coats of Rust-Oleum Sandable primer. And for the base, I gave it a few coats of a brown spray paint. Next, I taped off all the wooden parts since I wanted those to stay brown. And I gave it a few coats of gold spray paint. Unfortunately, I ran out of the gold spray paint I used on the rest of the costume, so I had to use a different spray paint, but I found using gold acrylic paint on top of that particular spray paint matched the rest of the costume really well. And then taking watered down brown acrylic paint, I used that to seep into all the edges and then rub it off with a paper towel. Some of the really small areas didn't pick up as well with the brown wash, so I just took normal acrylic paint and painted it on. Next, I taped off the gold areas and started to paint the wooden sections, and I dry brushed acrylic paint on top. There seemed to be two different woods on her bow, so for the lighter one I applied it more heavy, but for the darker one I lightly dry brushed it more so I could keep some of that dark color in the crevices. And for the lighter part I dry brushed on some darker brown for the crevices. Next, the bowstring and fabric wrappings. I used leftover fabric from the costume, and on the handle there's this design, so I took acrylic paint and painted it onto a strip of the fabric. And then I glued it on, wrapping it around to match the pattern. And you want to glue this really close to the seam line, but don't glue on top of it because you still want to take the bow apart. And I also glued on some leather cord. And the rest of the bow also got covered in normal blue fabric. And then I took more strips of fabric and tied it around the bow, gluing down the knot to secure it. And I left the edges raw so it had a frayed look. And here's how the bow looked. For the string I used a brown elastic cord. Using assorted beads, some I painted, and also rubber tubes that I painted with acrylic paint, I used that to decorate the bow. I used elastic cord to fake the bow look, that way it's safe at cons, and the rubber tubing so that it will bend with the cord. It's super hard to film, but I would just add a bead on, tie it while the cord was taut, and keep going the whole way down. And here's the finished bow. I can take it apart in half and also pull the cord back. And here's how I made the arrows. I also made the pattern in Adobe Illustrator, and I took a bunch of wooden dowels and cut them to length. For the arrowhead, I took oil-based clay and sculpted it into the shape I need. And I decided it was easier to sculpt the top part of the arrowhead from the bottom separate. And I made 2 arrowheads just so I had options for later. And using my knife, I carved into it. I wanted to make it look like it was an actual carved flint or rock arrowhead. And and then I made a silicone mold of it. For molds like this, cut a curved shape, that way it's easier to connect it together later. And then I made a bunch of arrowheads out of 2-part resin. Unfortunately, almost all of them had some air pockets in the small little tips, so I just fixed that later with epoxy sculpt, and I dremeled off that extra bit of resin on the bottom. And then I super glued it to the wooden dowel. And then using more epoxy sculpt, I filled in the gap and then sanded it down once it dried. And here's how the arrowheads looked. For the feathers, I traced out my pattern on 2mm craft foam. And then I cut it out. And then taking an X-Acto knife, I scored in a bunch of lines to add details to the feathers. And I heated it up with a heat gun very lightly to open up those cuts. And I cut out some notches for extra detail. I primed the arrows with a few layers of Plasti Dip and then painted them with acrylic paint. And then taking black watered down acrylic paint, I covered the entire feather with it, and then taking a paper towel, I wiped off the excess. This way that paint will fill in all those little lines. The arrows got a coat of a black hammered spray paint, and I stippled on gloss black acrylic paint as well to add some more texture. And I wrapped the arrow in copper wire and cord. And finally, I can super glue the feathers on. And here's how the arrows turned out. And on to the quiver and the knife sheath. They were made exactly the same way, and I made the patterns in Adobe Illustrator. I traced out the main shape of my pattern onto a folded piece of paper, and I cut that out of 2mm craft foam. I measured how much I would need in the fur and cut out strips, and then glued it together. And I used fabric glue instead of sewing so I could avoid any unwanted seams. And for the fabric, I sewed a lighter and darker colored pleather together. And taking those fur strips, I hand sewed them into the quiver. And using contact cement, I glued the foam to the fabric. And I sandwiched the foam in between 2 layers of fabric, the inside layer of fabric not having that fur sewn in. And I sewed straps onto the back. And then I sewed it shut right along the edge. Next, I punched holes out all along the edge. And then I looped a thin rope through. To make it easier, I covered the end of the rope in hot glue and cut it to a point. For the holes in the center, I used a soldering iron to burn the holes in, and then I looped it through with rope just like the edge. I also took hairspray to the fur to help it lay flat and to spike it. And finally, I wrapped it in a thicker rope. And here's what the finished sheath and quiver look like. I sewed the sheath onto the quiver with a thick cord, and the quiver attaches to the harness with snaps. And here's what the entire costume looks like with the bow, arrows, quiver, and sheath. Thank you so much for watching, and please check out the other videos on how I made the rest of the costume. And please subscribe, like, and follow for more.